Should Christians be socialists? And was C.S. Lewis a socialist? In this episode, I want to focus on the second question only, using Lewis as a starting point, given his huge popularity among Christians of many sorts. Clive Staples Lewis, known to millions through his Narnia series of fiction books, also made into big screen movies, and his many non-fiction works such as Mere Christianity, God in the Dock, and The Abolition of Man, was for many years a tutor and professor of medieval literature at Oxford and Cambridge universities, and so wrote scholarship in addition to popular work and public intellectual work. Now, Lewis's great popularity among Christians extends to those interested in politics. Many conservatives of various sorts, classical liberals, even some libertarians have wanted to enlist him for their causes. A recent book places Lewis in the natural law tradition, granting that natural laws are based on divine creation. But part of the challenge here is going to be that Lewis was not a systematic political thinker. He wasn't a political theorist and didn't write systematically on any of these issues. So as a reviewer puts it in a recent book on Lewis's politics and natural laws, the authors have some significant difficulties here systematizing Lewis's political thought just because he paid comparatively little attention to politics. While Lewis was largely apolitical, at one point after he became very famous, he declined a knighthood from the British government, for example. I actually respect him a great deal for his doing so. But he did engage in a lot of scattered remarks and paragraphs over his large body of work. And in our generation, early 21st century, Christians of many sorts are using Lewis in support of their political position. So it is worth giving a closer look to at his views, given his increasing popularity and continued popularity, including among scholars. So here's one author who says, quote, "He," that is to say Lewis, "always remained an Enlightenment liberal," unquote. Another says that we must recognize, quote, "Lewis's libertarian views," unquote. Another notes that, quote, "It's no secret that Clive Staples Lewis remains over a half a century after his death a superstar among American evangelicals." And those evangelicals are kind of neither Enlightenment liberals nor libertarian, in fact, are strongly conservative, and in some cases rather authoritarian conservatives. Now, that's a pretty wide range. From works published just in the last few years, Lewis was a liberal, according to one. He was a libertarian, according to another. He was a conservative, right, according to another. So what were Lewis's systematic political views? And I want to argue that the correct answer, with some qualifications, is none of the above. And for that, we'll turn to Lewis's own words, especially from his most important non-fiction book. But to keep you in suspense for a minute or two, I want to just say a couple of prefatory remarks here. When we do politics, there are two interrelated things that we need to do. What are going to be the processes that we're endorsing and going to put in place, and what should be the specific content of political rules, laws, regulations, and so forth. Those are interrelated, but they are also separable. So with respect to process, it is, I think, true to say that Lewis was opposed to concentrated power within government. His view was that human nature is so bad, he endorses a very, very strong version of original sin. Human nature is so sinful that power is dangerous. So he does endorse at various points various separations and dispersals of power. There should be no ruling elite, right, whether it's theocratic or scientific. On the content side, though, even if you are in favor of not concentrating political power, there still is the question of how many things you think should be under government control. And it does turn out in Lewis's case that's going to be lots, many of them. Last year, in 2018, I was interviewed by Glenn Beck. We had a good discussion. And at one point, Beck is a free market economy guy. He says he believes himself to be kind of libertarian and a free market economist advocate. But he confessed an internal tension because he's also a committed Christian. And on his reading of Christianity, it seems like Christianity is most compatible with socialism. So Beck is saying that he's got an internal tension that he's wrestling with at various points. How does he, on the one hand, believe that Christianity means he should be a socialist, but at the same time, part of him is a libertarian free market economist. Now, I think Beck is quite right to note the compatibility of Christian philosophy with socialism. And my point in this episode will be to say that C.S. Lewis himself agrees. He explicitly agrees that Christianity should mean an advocacy of a kind of socialism. It will not be a totalitarian, a big-scale centralized government kind of socialism, but rather a more small-scale communalism, right? A kind of socialism informed by Christian principles. So now let's turn to what I think is his most important nonfiction book, Mere Christianity. Mere Christianity began as a series of radio addresses in the early 1940s. It was published in some separate booklets several years later in the late 1940s, and then revisited and tidied up and polished and published as a book in 1952. Lewis was born, I believe, in 1898, so this is the intellectually mature C.S. Lewis in his 40s and in his 50s. Now the title, what does he mean by mere Christianity? Sometimes we use that as a bit of a dismissal. That's merely an opinion, right, and so forth. But that's not what Lewis means. What he means by mere Christianity is his identification of what are the basic principles or the themes and commitments that are common to all forms of Christianity. He's writing a book, he says, primarily for people who are not Christians, and he wants to make Christianity seem compelling and attractive to them. At the same time, he recognizes that his own views are Anglican, Church of England, and so he wants to guard against the danger that he's presenting only his particular Anglican approach to Christianity. So against that bias, he says that what he did was when he had the manuscript done, he sent it out to 4 professional Christians, clergy representatives of various traditions. He sent it to a Roman Catholic. He sent a copy to a Methodist, to another Anglican, to a Presbyterian. And they will all disagree with each other about this, that, and the other thing within Christianity. So what Lewis was asking them to do is to say, have I basically got Christianity right? Is there anything in this book that you, from your differing Christian perspectives, would say, no, that's not what Christianity stands for? And Lewis reports that all 4 of them wrote back to him after reading the manuscript, giving him a thumbs up, that they said basically everything that he said in Mere Christianity is, in fact, what Christians stand for. Now, in Mere Christianity, Lewis defends a wide range of key Christian positions. Why I think this is his most important book is that it's his most systematic, where he works through Christian metaphysics to its epistemology, presents and defends its views on human nature, and then most especially its ethics and social philosophy. And I say most especially because if you measure by the number of pages that are devoted to those areas in Mere Christianity, that seems to be the most important Christian set of areas. So let's get directly to it. Lewis, as I said earlier, explicitly aligns himself with the left and socialism. On what basis do I make that claim? So we're going to do the third book of Lewis's Mere Christianity. At this point, he turns systematically to working through its ethical principles and its social philosophy. And one chapter he entitles Christian Social Philosophy, and in it he says, quote, "A Christian society would be what we now call leftist," unquote. If we were to imagine, he asks us, a real Christian society, we would see that, quote, "its economic life was very socialistic," unquote. So, explicitly then, in Lewis's own words, he is a leftist and he is a socialist to the extent that he is a Christian. That then is to say, if you think that this is going to be a problem then for the more liberal and libertarian, right, folks who want to enlist Lewis for their cause, because typically part of that package is an endorsement of property rights and free market economics and so on. But Lewis goes on to say, and again, this is a direct quote, "There will be no manufacture of silly luxury items," unquote, for a moment there. That is to say, in a Christian society, anything that counts as a luxury item will not be manufactured. Now, who gets to decide what counts as a luxury item and so forth, and which ones particularly are silly? Well, that's not addressed here. But what we have, though, is a rejection of a free market society's where you leave it up to people to decide whatever it is that they're going to manufacture for themselves. Picking up that same quotation again, Lewis goes on to say, not only will there be no manufacture of silly luxury items, continuing the quote, and then even sillier advertisements to persuade us to buy them, unquote. So commercial advertising will be censored. We will not allow this in a proper Christian society. So we do know that in liberal and libertarian societies, one of the strong principles is freedom of speech, including the freedom of commercial speech. But here Lewis is saying Christianity is opposed to certain sorts of commercial free speech and is in favor of censoring advertisements, particularly advertisements of things that it judges to be silly. Further, in the exact same chapter on Christian social philosophy, Lewis goes on to point out that lending money at interest is consistently condemned by leading Christians across the centuries. And this then indicts the entire modern capitalist economic system. It's morally suspect. He does hedge his claims here, noting that he's not a professional economist, but he does insist, as a matter of the historic record, and that he understands the position here, interest is condemned by Christianity. Argues further, according to Christianity, that the entire reason one works is not to make profit and to live the American dream or whatever, but rather one works as a Christian in order to be able to give to charity and to give until it hurts. That's why you work, and as a good Christian in a society, that should be the rule. People should work and work hard so that they can be charitable. Quote, "The only safe rule about charity is to give more than we can spare," unquote. So the idea of working hard in order to make a profit and to enjoy the high life, and that we should be free to do so, that is condemned as immoral. And that is clearly, from Lewis's Christian perspective, going to undermine any sort of capitalist riches, the American dream kind of liberalism. So what we have so far from this chapter is Christian economics, Christian society, according to Lewis, would be socialist in his own words. No luxuries would be allowed. No advertising of those luxuries would be allowed. No charging interest on loans would be allowed, or charging interest with respect to investment would be allowed, and so on. Other points in the book, Lewis advocates various Christian perspectives that also undercut any sort of liberal or libertarian reading of his views. For example, one standard argument for liberal libertarianism is to argue that individuals should be free because they are competent to run their own lives, and what we should do is have respect for human beings, their ability to be self-responsible, that they don't need to have the government or the community or higher authorities looking after them, and so forth. We should be free and self-responsible agents in our own lives. Now, C.S. Lewis, by contrast, emphasizes to a very strong degree the personal weaknesses of every human being, both cognitive and moral. On the cognitive side, he does not believe that people are very strong or powerful. Now, when he's talking about religious issues, for example, he argues that no kind of lone wolf mystic or individual person can figure out for himself or herself what the truth is about the nature of the universe and so forth. You should try, of course. Persons have a responsibility to think for themselves, but they will not succeed. And so what Lewis goes on to argue is that we should be suspicious and reject outright the idea that there can be new prophets, new innovative ideas when it comes to religion and other important matters. Right? So, quote, "This is why all these people who turn up every few years with some patent simplified religion of their own as a substitute for the Christian tradition are really wasting time," unquote. He goes on to argue, you cannot do it yourself. That is to say, you cannot by your own self-responsible efforts figure out what's true. That can only come from God. Quote, "If he does not show himself, nothing you can do will enable you to find him," unquote. That then is to undercut the idea that people are cognitively powerful enough on these very important issues in their lives to figure out by their own efforts freely what they should be doing. He then goes on to argue because of our cognitive weakness as individuals, we need what he calls the map. That is to say, a map is the guidance about how to navigate through life that other people across history have developed. And so we should accept the traditional maps that are handed down to us. And so especially the smart people, the people who have devoted their life to thinking about theological matters. So what we then have is not an indirect undercutting of liberal libertarianism of some sort, but at least an undercutting of its principle that says we should respect people as cognitively competent enough to figure out what's right for themselves in their own lives and to go through lives on the basis of their own judgment. Lewis, from the start, is emphasizing your weakness and your need to rely on the cognitive judgment of other people. What about on the moral side of things? One liberal/libertarian approach is to say that people can be self-responsible, people can have dignity, they can have integrity, we can rely on ourselves, we can trust ourselves to do what we know is right. And so, broadly speaking, in society, we should extend liberty to all people on the grounds that they're going to be able to function as moral agents and self-responsible agents in society. Lewis, again, very strongly undercuts any advocacy of that sort of belief in the capacity for self-responsibility of individuals. Now, he does say that also Christianity should be seen as a fundamentally social, not an individualistic viewpoint. And what he says, this is on page 165 of my edition of Mere Christianity, is the following, quote, "God can show himself as he really is only to real men. And that means not simply to men who are individually good, but to men who are united together in a body, loving one another, helping one another, show him to one another. For that is what God meant humanity to be like players in one band or organs in one body. Consequently," this is continuing the quote, "the one really adequate instrument for learning about God is the whole Christian community waiting for him together," unquote. Now notice that this is very much an non-individualistic point. Your life is not about freely going off and living your life and doing whatever. And even if you have a religious purpose in your life, it's not that your individual quest to find God is the right way to go about it. Lewis is very explicitly saying that the proper approach is for the Christian community all to come together, to band together, that we are all just the organs of one body, and that should be the proper orientation of our life. So he goes on to say explicitly that we're not even really individuals. And he says, when you look around in the natural world, it seems like we are separate, adversarial, egocentric, whether we're all individuals, but that is an inappropriate perspective to take on what it is to be a human being. If we achieve a spiritual life, he goes on to say, these are his words, our spiritual life kills the natural life that is in it. Right? Now, the kill word is a direct quotation from Lewis. So you have to kill your individuality, your egocentricness, your separateness. And in place of that killed self, we become our true spiritual self, which is a collective organism. So Lewis is very much not individualistic. So any sort of attempt to put him in a liberal libertarian tradition that emphasizes self-responsibility, an individual quest in life, and seeing people as autonomous individuals is not Christian, and certainly not Christian social philosophy, according to Lewis. What about another kind of liberal libertarian principle that says we should have a free society, and it should be based on self-respect, and it should be based on belief in the dignity of every human being? Once again, we will find that C.S. Lewis is no ally here. Rather than self-respect and believing in the dignity of human beings, Lewis says that human beings should be humble. That if you realize who you are, you will realize that in fact you have no self-respect, that you have no dignity, and that this will come from understanding what Christian morality is requiring, because for Lewis that's the only proper morality, that as a human being you will try, sometimes systematically, usually more sporadically, you will try to live up to Christian morality, but you will fail because you are weak and because you are sinful. You will know what you're supposed to be doing, but you will have this immorality within you that will lead you not to try. So you will weakly and sinfully fail to live up to Christian morality. And then when you are honest with yourself and you realize that you are a failure, that you are sinful, your dignity will, this false pretense that you have some measure of self-respect will be stripped away from you. Who you really are in your own eyes will be made painfully aware to you. And in Lewis's words, the way he puts it is to say, you will come to realize that you are, quote, a small, dirty object, unquote. Understand that. You're a small, dirty object. That's what it is to be a human being. And that is, of course, the exact opposite of any understanding of inherent self-respect and the potential for dignity of human beings. And so Lewis goes then on to say that all of this failure, sinfulness, realizing that you're a small, dirty object, and the accompanying humiliation in your own eyes, Lewis then goes on to say that this is important because this is the thing that will then lead you to become a Christian in the best sense, that you will, quote, all of this trying and failing, rather, quote, leads up to the vital moment at which you turn to God and say, you must do this, I can't, unquote. So what we have is Lewis saying that human beings are not independent and shouldn't strive for independence, but in a very deep way they are dependent, and they must see themselves as dependent. They are not strong, they are weak, they are not dignified, they should be humble. And so to the extent that we are human beings, we need to have a support network. So we're not at all then liberal in the sense of saying that we're going to trust people to be self-responsible and competent to run their own lives. Human beings are dependent, and so our social outreach then should be a kind of mutual dependence and a mutual support network, so that we can come together in this collective fashion and worship God appropriately. Now, what about another important theme to people who are liberal libertarians, and that is a theme of universalism and equal liberty for all, that we should equally be free, and that these rights, say, to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, apply to all human beings universally. When we read Mere Christianity's chapters on sexual morality and marriage, we find a large number of kind of anti-liberal and anti-libertarian prohibitions. No sex outside of marriage, right, will be allowed because it is immoral. There should be no pornographic striptease acts. Divorce is immoral and inappropriate. Women, Lewis recognizes within the Christian tradition, are supposed to be subordinate, and Lewis defends the subordinate status of women. Homosexuality is inappropriate, and so forth. With respect to the relationship between women and men. This is not universal rights, universal liberties, and any sort of equality. So those liberal libertarian principles need to be set aside. Within Christian marriages, this is the way it should be. Quote, Christian wives promise to obey their husbands. In Christian marriages, the man is said to be the head. Of course, this is a voluntary relationship that women are entering into, but obviously if you are going in right with the viewpoint that there is unequal liberty, there's not a universal standing of human beings, that's going to militate against any sort of liberal libertarianism that bases itself on universality and equality of principles. One other point, and this one takes up the liberal libertarian approach that wants to justify its political philosophy on the basis of a principle of self-ownership. Often slavery is seen as the opposite of any sort of liberal libertarianism, on the grounds that slaves are not allowed self-ownership. They're also not allowed property rights. They're not allowed all sorts of things. But the basic principle is that human beings metaphysically should be seen as beings that have this property of self-ownership. You cannot be owned, and your orientation should not be to hire anything that has ownership claims on you. In the third book of Mere Christianity, again, Lewis, and I'll give you a quotation here, then we'll draw the implications out. So on this point of self-ownership, quote, does it not make a great difference whether I am, so to speak, the landlord of my own mind and body, or only a tenant responsible to the real landlord? If somebody else made me for his own purposes, then I shall have a lot of duties which I should not have if I simply belonged to myself, unquote. So the principle that I do belong to myself, I own myself, Lewis is here explicitly rejecting that. And then he gives us the landlord-tenant analogy. Right? And in the case of a tenant, you should see yourself as a tenant of your body, of your mind, but really they belong to someone else. So if your liberalism is based on any sort of self-ownership, you cannot be a Christian in the Lewisian sense. Your orientation should not be to think that you have your own life, that it's yours to do with what you decide, to act how you choose, to pursue happiness in your own way. Instead, your life belongs to another. You are to obey. You are to do your duties. And that metaphysical model is authoritarian. It's not at all libertarian or liberal. Now, a lot of those remarks are suggestive, and they do require some interpretive work, but even the suggestive remarks, we do have to put them together with his explicit remark that he thinks Christians should be socialist, that they should be leftist. Now, we have a problem here, that at various other places, though, Lewis does say that Christians should not necessarily impose their beliefs on non-Christians. There's one Lewis-friendly commentator, David Thoreau, who's also a kind of libertarian. He notes that Lewis is politically in the natural law tradition, with natural law underwritten by supernatural law. But he points out that acceptance of the law, Lewis also says this, is a matter of individual conscience. Also, Lewis does recognize that not only Christians have insight into this natural law that's underwritten by supernatural law, as he recognizes that other religious traditions in various ways have had some glimpse into the existence of God and what God commands to human beings. So Lewis does, at various points, resist any sort of theocratic imposition of Christianity upon everyone. And so he does, when he surveys the various political possibilities out there, advocate a kind of democracy as the least bad of the available alternatives. So at this point, what can we say definitely about Lewis? And here's my list. I think we can say he's definitely Christian. He definitely is socialist. He's definitely, though, not a centralized authoritarian. He's definitely not a libertarian, definitely not a capitalist. and he also is definitely not an advocate of sex or gender equal rights. Beyond that, he does seem to favor some sort of communalism, some sort of democratic republicanism, but he does not work these out in any degree of systematicity. He does seem to agree in some sort of overlap of religion and politics, not a complete separation, but again, this is not worked out. And that means that what we're left with when we read Lewis is a set of views that are in tension with each other. And I would put the tension this way. Lewis believes that Christianity is correct. And he also believes that good politics, the laws of a good politics, should be an application of moral law. And he also believes that in a democracy, one should vote one's conscience. But he also says that he doesn't want to impose his views politically. So we're left with a hard question here. Within a democracy, when should Christians stop being Christian? Because it seems like you have to, but at the same time, you don't. And this is the tension here. One answer to that question seems to be never. Right? Christians believe that Christianity should govern all of one's life, and politics is a part of life. So the principal implication would be that the tools of politics should be subordinate to religion and used for religious purpose. Now, the fact that Lewis was personally uncomfortable with authoritarian theocracy and political dictatorships, I think that's to his personal credit. And that, though, seems to imply not imposing Christianity even democratically. And even though that means allowing an immoral society to exist, because, lots of Christians then will be free to act on their immoral views. And it also seems to make impossible the exact kind of collective salvation of mankind that Lewis believes is our entire purpose for existing. Now, that sort of tension, my view as a philosopher is to say that Lewis's philosophical and theological principles are the ones that are going to prevail over his more personal level of comfort or discomfort with their degree of application. So I would conclude that those of us who are classical liberals or libertarians, we should take note of his general principles and resist seeing C.S. Lewis as an ally, because his general principles do undercut political freedom from a variety of directions, and they do support a kind of Christian socialism in practice.